This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today on the show, I have Richard Lewis. Richard Lewis is a cross-cultural expert. Having traveled to 130 countries plus, I think he speaks 11 languages. He's been at this his entire career, language, communication. Now, some might say, Mike, why do you want to have a language expert on your trend-following trading show? I love to have trend-following traders on my show, and that's never going to stop. But we live in a complete world. We live in a real world. You're not just a trend-following robot. There are many, many facets to life. And my guest today brings one of those facets that we can't ignore, which is the ability to communicate cross-culturally. Richard has developed a model that classifies cultural norms into linear active, multi-active, and reactive, or some combination. This was a huge light bulb for me. Such a great aha moment. What a fantastic conversation. What an interesting guy. What an awesome life he has led. I hope you enjoy.
Hello, Richard Lewis here.
Hey, Richard. This is Mike Covel. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good afternoon to you. Good evening, wherever you are. Are you in Saigon?
I am in Saigon tonight.
Well, I was in Saigon during the war.
Yeah.
Doing a little job for the American Army.
A little job, huh?
Yeah, it was kind of, an educational job, but nevertheless, I was there for a few weeks.
Yeah.
1967, yeah. So, what can I do for you?
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the wisdom you can impart to my audience, but maybe first we can start with a little bit about you and your career. And the most notable thing that jumps out, and of course you've heard this many, many times, you speak 11 languages.
Yeah, different degrees of fluency. I speak fluent French, fluent Swedish, fluent German, and so on. And then other languages less fluently, but have a good working knowledge, like Japanese and Finnish. Yeah.
Where did that start? Where did that love affair with language start?
I think during the war, I used to listen to a lot of foreign broadcasts given by the BBC, when I was 6, 7, 8, just the beginning of the war. And I used to hear all these exciting broadcasts, about how the war was going on, first in English, and then I'd hear them from some of the occupied countries. We used to broadcast to Norway in Norwegian, to Denmark in Danish, and so on. And I used to listen to these foreign broadcasts, and I got to understand a fair amount of what they were saying, because they were repeating what they'd said in English a little earlier. And then, of course, at school, I started learning French and loved it, and developed an interest in, other languages. I learned Italian at 16, and then I went to university and took French, Spanish, and Italian. I took 3 different degrees. And then it went on. I went to Germany, I went to live in Finland, I went to live in Japan, and picked up languages as I went along. It's not so difficult, really.
Well, okay, that there might be a lot of people in my audience that are sitting back and saying it's not so difficult. But let's say you're like me, or I'm a man in my 40s, and I took some Spanish in college, did pretty well at it, but I'm now in Vietnam, and I want to start. I mean, can you give, for the audience out there that really wants to get off their and do this, and clearly you've dedicated your life to language, what is a good way to start?
Well, one of the maxims is that you've got to get a grammar book and learn the verbs. And then when you know the verbs, you can then go to the country and you pick up vocabulary, automatically by being there and by living there and encountering people. But it's not so easy if you've not a working knowledge of the verbs. So I don't believe in learning a language entirely through a grammar book, but it would be a good start with the verbs and then pick up vocabulary as you go along. Mm. That's one way of learning a language. The other way is simply go to the country and start working. And, for instance, I went to Finland with no knowledge of Finnish. It was after the Olympic Games in 1952. And I got a job on a farm because I'd run out of money to get back to England. And I worked on this farm for a year. And half the laborers spoke Finnish and half of them spoke Swedish. And simply by working alongside them, I learned the languages, at least to have a working knowledge of the languages. If you see someone pulling back on a horse and shouting, "Takaisin pelkele," that's Finnish for whoa, whoa, reining it in backwards. You pick up things practically like that.
Richard, it's secondhand to you, but the notion of travel, there are so many people that don't travel. I've had the good fortune to do some travel, but why don't you talk to the wisdom that travel brings? Because some of the topics that I'd like to move into with you today, but travel, the wisdom that it brings, the insights, and getting you away from a narrow-minded perspective. Travel's just a magic elixir, isn't it?
Of course it is, yes. Well, they say travel broadens your mind, and it does in many ways. They say even that when you learn two languages, you have two different sets of values, you have two different characters in a way. And when you travel and you see other people and the way they live and what they do and why they do it, it broadens your horizons in a cultural manner. And you understand, why certain people do things in what seemed earlier a rather strange way, but it's simply because, they're living in a different climate or a different country, different set of rules.
I'd like to go into, as you bring that different set of rules up, and I guess what you call the Lewis model. And I'm looking at 3 columns of essentially how to look at language culture. And you have linear active, multi-active, and reactive. And
right.
Linear active, and you could correct me here, linear active would be North America, North Europe. Multi-active would be the Middle East, Southern Europe, South America. Latin America. And then reactive would be Asia. And we can't go through every one of the differences in the points. It's a great chart that I think everybody needs to take a peek at. But for example, I'll let you comment on this, but I look at my life right now as an American who happens to be in Asia, who happens to be dating an Asian woman. And we get along great, but there are those cultural moments. And I'm looking at your chart right now, and the first thing that it says is, linear active, me, American, talks half the time. Now, reactive, the first thing it says is listens most of the time.
Yes, well, that's perfect for you with your girlfriend, you see. You can talk and she'll listen. If she's an Asian. Right,
but I can't tell you how many times this year she said to me, "You talk so much."
Well, that's what it seems to them. Actually, Americans and Northern Europeans, Germans, and so on, even the British, we talk about half the time, and we're not noted for being particularly talkative. Americans maybe a little more than British, but then if you compare us with the Latins, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and then Greeks, and Arabs, they talk much more. They would dominate, let's say, 75% of the conversation in a normal for them, you see. So, and then the reactives, they are people, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, they react to what we say, so they always like us to speak first. So if we're having a business meeting, they would say, "What is your position?" And we tell them our position, and then they react to it. And they like to speak second because they can modify their reply, their action, their position, so as not to give us offense. Whereas if they speak first, the American might say to them, "I don't like any of these ideas," and then he would lose face. So it's much safer in Asia to let the other side speak first.
As you start to break these down, the linear active, the multi-active, the reactive, I mean, this is, for anybody today doing business. And when I was looking at these, I was like, wow, it's so much more complicated to do successful business than I think we even perceive when you start to break it down in language and culture, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, if you're used to doing business in America and you go and try to do it in Japan or Italy, there are such big cultural differences that you would make a lot of mistakes right away. I mean, when you go to Japan, if you meet your Japanese counterpart and you grab his hand and shake it vigorously and put your arm around his shoulder and say, "How are you, Taro?" You've already committed 3 or 4 mistakes for which he will not forgive you very quickly. In Japan, all of us, not just Americans, we need to be far more polite and courteous than we are in our own countries. And so Japanese perceive nearly all people as rude because they don't observe, these levels of Japanese courtesy. And if you go to Germany and you talk, in circles a bit, the Germans don't like it. They want everything to be direct. And the Germans believe in direct speech, and even more than the Americans. And the German, if he doesn't like something you've done, he will criticize you openly. He'll say, you are wrong, or I don't like what you say. And they're not being rude in that respect. They're being honest and saving time and, giving their opinions in a straightforward manner, which Americans are pretty good at, but not so direct as the Germans, whereas we British, we are not so direct. If you put a stupid idea on the table for an Englishman, he doesn't say that's a stupid idea. He says, Michael, interesting idea. So we're a bit devious ourselves, even though we are basically linear active.
Hey, talk about, this is something that's been very new for me. Talk about the idea of losing face and the three different linear active, multi-active, reactive. Talk about losing face. How would you even describe the idea of losing face, what it means, and how it fits into cross-cultural communication?
Well, losing face means that you do something which is against your reputation. Let's, for instance, suppose you're a good painter, but a poor mathematician. Now, if you make a mistake in maths, you don't lose any face because that's not your reputation. But if you paint a painting and it looks awful, then you lose face because you're supposed to paint good, you're supposed to be a professional painter, and you've lost the reputation. So that is basically how you lose face. Now, of course, you can lose face by some people being too direct with you and being, brutally direct, and that would cause any Asian to lose face. So you would never say to an Asian, I don't like your suit, or you're wearing the wrong tie. I mean, there are things like that we may or may not wish to say, as a kind of personal remark or even a joke, but you can't joke with Asians like that. You've got to be far more serious than with Americans or Australians.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sometimes find though that they will joke back with me. I might hear some line from them, but it's interesting the way you put it in terms of the directness that you have to. Subtlety is much more important.
Yes, of course. Linear active people are direct. Multi-active people, they're not particularly indirect. They're a little bit indirect, but of course Asians are very indirect, so they would never criticize you openly. I mean, even if you're in a room which is too hot, they would never say to you, why don't you open the window? They would say something like, it's a little stuffy in here, isn't it? They would never ask you to do anything directly because it would sound too much like an instruction or an order.
Richard, I'm going to pop around a couple different ideas, topics, different perspectives, but, we all see when we travel, we see perhaps a McDonald's or a Starbucks and at all different locations around the world these days. And I think maybe we see everybody wearing blue jeans. Maybe people are dressed very similar. And we start to think, wow, these culture is becoming, it's one size fits all.
You think these people are like us, yeah.
That's not exactly accurate, is it?
Well, you see, there are two kinds of culture. I mean, there are many kinds of culture, but basically there's microculture and macroculture. Now, microculture are habits and customs which are not terribly important. The macroculture is religion, your concepts of truth and honesty and so forth. But microculture is things like dress, what you wear, what you eat, the fact that you play games. So if you look at the young people in the world, about 75% of them, a lot of the time wear T-shirts. And with the T-shirts they wear jeans. And this can be Japanese or Chinese youth or Arabs or French or Italian or American. They wear T-shirts and jeans, they go around eating hamburgers and they drink Coca-Cola. So you think completely Americanized. But it's not true. That's microculture which they accept. Let's say in Japan they play baseball, and in Cuba they play baseball. But Cubans and Japanese are very different from Americans. So that's the microculture which gives you the impression that cultures are all becoming alike. There's a well-known example of a bunch of Arab youths, I think it was in Beirut about 20 years ago. They attacked the American embassy. But prior to doing so, they had been in a bar having hamburgers and Coca-Cola, and they all wore white T-shirts and blue jeans. So, that shows how microculture can deceive you into thinking that people are becoming alike.
I'll give you a great example. I'll let you comment on this. I was recently at my girlfriend's, her family had an event, and I was at the event. And, I've noticed in the last year and a half, being in and out of Asia, the Asian folks just love to see, can the white guy use chopsticks? And I can, but it's a really interesting test for them. I think that the respect level for you goes up dramatically if you can.
Yeah, I don't find it too easy either. I lived in Japan for 5 years.
I'm pretty good at it. But here's the interesting one that I was not familiar with. So I'm at a round table, and my girlfriend starts directing me. She's feed the other people at the table. So there was common food in the middle, and so I had to reach in with chopsticks and put the food on other people's bowls or plates. And again, there's a cultural issue that you would just never see in America, probably in Britain for sure either.
Yeah, you have to learn a bit about, before you go to a country, you should read a little bit about the history and the customs. It helps a lot. You read a short book, what to do, do's and don'ts in Japan, that kind of thing. It's very helpful. But of course you learn when you're there, but you tend to learn by your mistakes, which is the more arduous procedure.
Yeah, for sure. Let me jump into the idea of teams. And there's so many different topic areas we could go today. But
team, did you say teams?
Yeah, I said teams. So putting teams together. And I think there's a lot of different ways when one can look at it, but we can say a homogenous team or a team made up of different cultures. Effectiveness today, is it homogenous teams that are more effective, or is it the cross-cultural teams?
Well, it depends on the task facing the team, If you are going to make a new factory for making matches in northern Sweden, and a bunch of 5 or 6 or 7 Swedes will be the best team to do it. But if you're going to make a factory in Chile, and they've got to go over there, it would be better to have 1 or 2 Chileans involved, or at least South Americans who understand the culture. So you find that the simple tasks being performed in the home country, the home team is better. And if it's in, let's say, just Germany, you could have a bunch of Germans and Dutch and Swiss and maybe Belgians all working together well. But if you're setting up a nuclear reactor in an Arab country, if the people involved are going to be maybe Koreans doing the construction and advisors from Singapore and so forth, then it's a far more complicated issue which might last, over a period of 5 years. And for that you need a very well qualified international team with 5 or 6 nationalities to represent, the different interests involved and to understand the different cultural problems that can arise when those nationalities are working together. So the answer is, in general, a simple task is better performed by a bunch of people who know each other very well, who are all from the same country, and a more complicated one by a more complicated team.
As you talk about differences in culture right there, often I would think that depending on our home culture, our home country, we're going to have different angles, different perspectives, and we're going to have things that we hold sacred that might be completely different in another country. And I think our natural reaction is to think, oh, they're wrong, we're right.
Yeah, well, look at punctuality. Punctuality was not invented in Mexico, right? So the Americans are very punctual, Germans are very punctual, but the Mexicans don't see any particular reason to be punctual, and neither do Italians. What Germans do. So it's very much, what you've been brought up to see in your own country, and what you consider it normal. So if anyone's different from you, you consider them abnormal. That's a logical process of thought, isn't it? There we are. I once worked for the German radio, and my job was I was a news announcer, and I had to read the news in English every day at noon, and I was given the news in German in the morning at 9 o'clock, so one translated it, and then it only took about an hour, but come to the office at 9, and then sit around for 2 hours and then go and read a broadcast. Well, we were 4 people, one British, one French, one Italian, and one Spaniard. And as it turned out, the Frenchman and the Spaniard and the Portuguese were all fairly punctual people. So we all came in at 9 o'clock, translated our news, drank coffee till noon, and then read the news. The Italian, the 4th one, he was not punctual, and he never came in at 9 o'clock. He came in at 9:30 or 10 o'clock, or even 10:30, and he was so good at translating, he could always translate in time. But of course, he infuriated the German editors who were wondering where he was at 9 o'clock. And I remember his particular editor, a man called Pfefferkorn, used to wait for him anxiously until he saw him coming through the door. Now, one morning, the Italian, when it was raining, the Italian didn't come in until 11:15. Pfefferkorn was beside himself with rage, with anger, with anxiety, and the moment Giovanni walked in, he shouted at him, "Giovanni, you should have been here at 9 o'clock. And Giovanni said, "Why? What happened?" And the German said, "Well, nothing happened." He said, "Well, why should I have been here at 9 o'clock?" Now, the rest of us all started laughing. These men lived in completely two different worlds. For the German, it was important he should be there at 9 o'clock. For the Italian, it was important they should do a good broadcast. Different worlds.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen too, a comparison in different worlds, the paperwork, and this applies to whether I've seen in China, Japan, Vietnam, the paperwork in Asia is dramatically increased than what I see in America. It sometimes it drives me up the wall. The Japanese desire for paperwork and bureaucracy is extremely high. And I want to draw a conclusion in my own mind. Oh my gosh, this is unnecessary. But that's probably not the right way to look at it. That's just a cultural difference.
Well, Americans like to do things quickly, and you do things much more quickly orally than in writing. That's one aspect. The Japanese, their concern is to get it all right, and therefore you can make mistakes, orally that you don't mistake when you have plenty of time to write it down. So I think there's something in that, how kind of adventurous or how cautious a culture is. That might explain why they use more paper.
Yeah. Hey, going back to your model, the linear active, multi-active, reactive, I'd love for you to comment on this one. So the linear active person is confronting with logic. The multi-active person is confronting emotionally. The reactive person is never confronting. Could you talk to those differences and contrast and compare? If you've got an example, even be great too.
Well, you're an American, I'm British, I first certain respect for logic. We're kind of calm people, the British. Americans are certainly not quite so calm, but they're logical, and you can prove a point. The Americans very often say, let's tell it how it is. Your love for truth and directness and logic. Now, and then you can prove your point and get your way. Now, an Italian who can't get his way with his counterpart, he's not all that hot on logic or directness as we are, so he's likely to resort to emotion, to persuasion, and to tell you how fond he is of you, and he hopes that you'll help him out of this mess or whatever he's in. The Italians believe that they can persuade anybody anything if they have them in front of them long enough. And it's a natural thing which Latins have resort to. Arabs will do the same thing. They'll say, you must do this. You're my friend. You can't deny your friend, this favor. And then, of course, you get to the Asians, and they just don't believe in confrontation because they think it sets the business back. It leaves a scar on the relationship. So they will be indirect. They will never say no, or they will never say I disagree. They will say, I agree up to a point, or I'll bear it in mind, or I'll do my best. And that way, they're avoiding upsetting people. So you can see what the three mentalities are in terms of, confrontation.
Yeah. As I was preparing to talk to you today and looking through some of your work, your writings, prior interviews, the idea as a business person, we might like to think, hey, it's all about quantity and price. But the reality is, as we're talking today, there's so much more to making a deal than just quantity and price.
That's for sure. They're both important things, of course, and ultimately it comes down to price, doesn't it? If you're buying or selling, and then whatever the price is, you've got to provide the quality which you've described. So that is true, but it's not just that, because while an American or a German will buy the best product at the best price according to their reasoning, a Spaniard or a Mexican or an Arab will prefer to buy for a person whom they like. So you got the best product in American, but they don't like your direct method or whatever your manner is. Some Italian has been very friendly to them and really flattering them and so forth and showing compassion and empathy. They're likely to buy from the Italian at a higher price and possibly for a less quality. So that's the way the world is, we're human beings. We're swayed by many things other than just hard facts and price and quality.
Until I came, and I've traveled before, even in the last year and a half, I've been living in and out of Asia, but it's fascinating that when you really when you live in the middle of it, when you're traveling in the middle of it, to see those differences and start to realize how complex and how big this world is. We can have the internet and there can be a Starbucks everywhere, but it's just not as organized and tidy as we might like to imagine.
No, well, you got to bear in mind constantly what I said about microculture and, macroculture. It's not too difficult with enough advertising to get the whole world drinking Coca-Cola, But with advertising or with any other kind of method, you cannot persuade people to think the same way about things like religion, truth, honesty, all these things are rather deep, philosophical or religious concepts. And according to, for instance, the way a Muslim is brought up and the way Hindu is brought up and the way Christian is brought up, they have different sets of rules. And they don't want to swap those easily for anybody else's. It's part of our natural training as we're growing up. And as you're growing up among a lot of people who behave the same way that you do, you think that, that's the right way to live. I mean, most Americans think that the American way of life is the best way of life. Whereas Japanese, living in a very different society, see Americans as behaving in a way which is not suitable for them in Japan. And then you've got other countries like Spain and France who believe that their system is best. So it's, it's a complicated world in that respect.
You mentioned Japan. You said you've lived there for 5 years?
Yes.
I've been in and out of Tokyo 6-7 times, been to Kyoto, and I love Tokyo. There's something, there's something magical about it, isn't it? There's just something.
Tokyo is you're quite right. Yeah. There's an atmosphere which is contributed to not only by the Japanese, who are in a way the most international of Japanese, the ones who live in Tokyo. They're more open to ideas than the ones who live in the country. But it's also contributed to by the expats who live there. There is a very good international and expat life in Tokyo. And I experienced it, once I got to know people after the first year. I mean, you could go to a cocktail party every night. The circuit is vigorous. It's interesting, it's enlightening, and it's vibrant. So I couldn't agree more. Tokyo is a wonderful place to live.
Yeah, I could go for the good Japanese sushi. Is there such thing as bad Japanese sushi? But
Japanese food is, along with Italian, in my opinion, the best food in the world. Again, I agree with you. It's wonderful food. You can keep nice and slim as well if you stick to it.
This is true indeed. Hey, Richard, listen, it was good chatting today. Where is the best place we can send the audience to read more about you, your firm? Where's the best place they can go?
Well, I've written a book which has sold about 1 million copies, and I think they could start with that. It's called When Cultures Collide. When Cultures Collide, it deals with about 100 countries. The first half of the book talks about culture, the theories and so on, like we've done today. And the second half of the book examines it from 80 to 100 countries in depth and, says what makes them tick. And that book is available from Amazon and any good bookstore. It's sold a lot in America. That's where to start. And then I wrote another book recently called When Teams Collide, which, because I've been asked to by many companies, how do we form an effective, international team to work for us in different countries. So that's a pretty good start. When Cultures Collide and When Teams Collide. Well, finally, I wrote a book together with a Dane a few months ago called Fish Can't See Water. And fish can't see water implies that we can't see our own culture. So I wrote this with a Danish gentleman, very clever man in the recruiting business, and we show there that you can't see your own culture. Fish can't see water, but you better learn about it because it's different from the people's culture, and you've got to adapt to certain things when you're doing business. So those 3 books would be a pretty good start.
Well, I appreciate the time today, Richard. Fascinating, and I'm a little bit envious. I think it just sounds like a terribly fun career. When you start to dive in and look at all these differences, because then you appreciate everybody and you see all these fun differences. It's so fun.
Yes, you don't condemn when you've been around. I mean, I've been to 136 different countries, and I have a boat also, and of course I've sailed around the world twice. So when you see so many cultures and see them on their home ground, like in Fiji and Tonga and so on, you get to appreciate that they have to live in a way different from yourself. The geographical conditions, or the climatic conditions, make life, it has to be lived in a certain way. And climate is quite important for character and for culture. So travel, as you said earlier, travel really develops, your interest in other people, and develops your empathy and sympathy for other people, and that's how it's been with me anyway. And I've enjoyed my life, traveling around and doing that.
So, will you go around the world anymore in terms of the sailing, or
possibly once more? You should do everything in 3s, maybe once more if I can get the boat to do it.
Hey, listen. Hey, I was most appreciative of you taking the time today, and thanks again.
A nice chat. I enjoyed speaking to you, Michael.
Thank you. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.